15 seconds earlier, my wife was laughing in the passenger seat and my little girl was humming in the back. Then a pair of headlights tore through the rain like a freight train coming straight at us, and in that split second, I understood I might lose everything I loved. I remember the sound before anything else. Rain hammering the windshield, wipers struggling, tires hissing on wet pavement. I was driving us home from the mall outside Dallas, Lauren leaning her head back, still smiling from the day we had. Our daughter Emma had fallen asleep hugging the stuffed rabbit we bought her. It should have been an ordinary night. Just another family ride home after a perfect afternoon. Lauren reached over and touched my arm. "You drive too much like your dad when it rains? Slow down, Mark." She said it gently, teasing more than scolding. I eased off the gas and looked at her for a heartbeat. 35 years old, soft hair damp from the mist. The woman who made the world feel like it finally made sense. I squeezed her fingers. "I got you." She smiled and closed her eyes. The storm grew heavier as we merged onto the highway. Traffic spread out like shadows in the downpour. Emma stirred and murmured something about her rabbit. I glanced into the rear mirror just to feel that familiar warmth of being her dad. Everything was good. Everything felt right. Then the lights came. 2 blazing white beams broke through the curtain of rain. They were swinging, jerking. Not in their lane. At first I thought the driver was sliding. Then I saw the front of the truck fishtailing, coming toward us, angled. Too fast. Too close. My chest tightened. My hands locked on the wheel. Lauren sat up straight. "Mark." I tried to swerve toward the shoulder, but the road was nothing but water. The tires lost grip. The whole car drifted sideways. I tapped the brakes, but the back end swung harder. The truck roared into our lane, and the sound of its engine drowned the radio and the wind and even my own voice. Oddly, in the instant before impact, I had time for one thought. Please let them be safe. The crash was a violent punch to the world. Metal screeched like it was being torn apart. Glass exploded into the air. Something slammed into my chest. The car spun and flipped, and everything became noise and weight and blackness and pain. I could not tell which way was up or down. I heard Lauren scream my name. I heard Emma cry. Then it all collapsed into a hollow quiet. When the car finally stopped moving, I hung upside down. Blood dripped from my forehead into my eyes. Rain poured through the shattered window. My legs felt like they were not there. I tried to move them, but nothing happened. Panic set in fast and cold. "Lauren, Emma." My voice came out as a broken whisper. My hands shook as I fought with the seatbelt. It released, and I fell onto the roof of the car, which was now the floor. Pain shot up my spine like fire, but I dragged myself through the broken glass toward the passenger side. Lauren was slumped forward, her hair covering her face. I touched her cheek. It was cold, too cold. She did not move when I said her name. She did not open her eyes. A thin line of blood ran down her neck. Emma was still strapped into her booster seat. Rain splashed through the broken window onto her tiny shoes. Her rabbit lay on the floor. I reached toward her, praying for any sound. Her body was limp when I touched her arm. My breath caught, my chest collapsed inward. I shook my head because my mind refused to accept what my eyes saw. No, sweetheart, please." The world blurred. Sirens wailed somewhere far away. The smell of gasoline mixed with rain and blood. I tried to pull myself closer to her, but my arms gave out. My vision flickered like someone was dimming the lights on the world. I felt myself slipping away, sliding backward into the dark. The last thing I remember before everything went silent was my own voice begging God to let this be a nightmare. Then there was nothing. When I opened my eyes again, the world was white. Bright lights, antiseptic, machines beeping. I could not move my legs. I could barely breathe. Someone said my name, a voice soft and trembling. "Mark, you are awake?" Julia Moreno sat beside the hospital bed, soaked mascara on her cheeks. My sister-in-law, only 29, but she looked years older in that moment. Her hands were cold when she grabbed mine. I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. "Lauren, Emma, where are they? Please tell me they are okay." Julia pressed her lips together and looked away. She could not hold my eyes. The silence told me everything. I felt something inside me tear clean through. I tried to sit up, but my back screamed. The doctor rushed in and held me down. His voice was calm in a way that made everything worse. "You cannot move like that, Mr. Callahan. Your spine was severely injured. We are evaluating the extent of paralysis." Paralysis. The word echoed for a long time before I understood it. But none of that pain compared to the moment Julia finally whispered the truth. They did not make it, Mark. Lauren and Emma died at the scene. The beeping of the monitor sped up. My breath broke. My whole body shook with a grief too big to fit inside anything human. I screamed their names until my voice cracked. I reached for them, even though they were not there. I begged for one more chance, one more second, one more breath with them. When the exhaustion finally dragged me back into stillness, I stared at the ceiling, unable to feel anything except the weight of a world that had ended. Outside the window, rain still fell. Soft, steady, almost peaceful. It was the same rain from the night everything disappeared, and I lay there listening to it, not knowing that the worst was yet to come. The rain outside the window kept tapping like it was reminding me that the world was still moving, even if mine had stopped. I lay there staring at the ceiling while everything inside felt hollow. A nurse adjusted the IV line on my arm and asked if I needed anything. I shook my head. My voice had nothing left in it. Some time passed. Minutes or hours, I could not tell. Julia had not left the room. She sat with her hands folded tight like she was holding herself together. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin. "The doctors said you were unconscious for almost 2 days. They called me because I was the emergency contact Lauren listed. I thought you should know." I nodded, but the words did not fully settle. My mind kept flickering between the hospital room and the twisted metal on the highway. My spine ached with a deep, throbbing pain, but the heaviness in my chest was crushing everything else. I tried again to move my legs. Nothing. They might as well have belonged to someone else. Panic crept up my throat. Why can't I feel anything? Why can't I move them? My hands gripped the sheets until my fingers trembled. The doctor returned. He looked older under the fluorescent lights, tired but careful. "Mr. Callahan, you suffered a severe spinal cord injury in the crash. The damage is significant. We will do everything we can, but you should prepare for the possibility that you may not walk again." The words landed like a blow to the ribs. I whispered that I understood, but the truth is, I did not. My mind rejected it. I was healthy. I worked out. I carried my daughter on my shoulders every weekend. Paralysis was something that happened to someone else, not me. Not in one night. I looked at Julia, hoping she would say something to anchor me. She only reached for my hand and held it gently. Her face was red and swollen from crying. She had always been the cheerful one at family gatherings, and seeing her like that felt wrong. "I am so sorry, Mark. I wish I had something better to say." After the doctor left, she wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "There is something else you need to know. I handled the funeral arrangements. Lauren wanted to be buried near White Ridge Park, the cemetery with the oak trees. Emma has a smaller plot right beside her. It was beautiful, quiet. My throat tightened again. I wanted to ask why she did all that alone, but the answer came even before I formed the question. Did my parents-in-law come? She hesitated, looked away. No, they did not show up. They said they had things to take care of and they could not make it. The room tilted. I felt heat rush through my chest. They did not come to their own daughter's funeral. My daughter's funeral. I tried to push myself upright, but pain shot through my spine and I fell back against the pillows. Anger rose, but it was too tangled with grief to come out clearly. I could only whisper that I needed a minute. Julia stood quietly and walked to the window to give me space. I stared at my legs under the blanket and knew I was trapped in a body that no longer worked. Lauren was gone. Emma was gone. Her parents wanted nothing to do with me. It felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to the foundation of my life. After a long silence, I asked Julia to help me reach my phone. I needed to hear my father's voice, even if we had never been close. I dialed his number. The screen reflected my bandaged face as I waited. He answered with the same business tone he used in every conversation. "What is it, Mark?" I told him about the crash, about Lauren and Emma, about the paralysis. I told him I needed him to come for the funeral arrangements because I could not leave the hospital. There was a pause, then he said he was in a meeting and would look into it later. Then he hung up, just like that. I stared at the blank screen until Julia gently pulled the phone from my hand. "Mark, I know this hurts, but maybe he needs time. People do not always react well to tragedy." I nodded because I did not have the strength to argue. I called my mother next. She was even colder. "I am very busy too. I cannot drop everything. Handle it yourself." She ended the call before I could say another word. The nurse walked in to check my vitals and found me shaking. She placed a hand on my shoulder and asked if I needed the pain meds adjusted. I said no. The physical pain was the only thing that made me feel anything at all. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. It was the office where I'd spent 8 years building a career. I thought maybe they were checking on me. Maybe someone was offering condolences. Instead, Jeff spoke with his usual clipped tone. "The project you were leading is in trouble due to your absence. Management has reassigned your responsibilities. We are reviewing your employment status." I tried to explain. "Jeff, I was in a crash. I lost my family. I am paralyzed. Please give me time to recover. Please." He cut me off. "This is not personal. It is strictly about business continuity. We cannot wait for an indefinite recovery. Good luck." The call ended. I stared at the ceiling because I could not bear to look at Julia. My voice cracked as I said, "They fired me. I have nothing left. Nothing." Julia sat on the edge of the bed and pulled me into her arms. "You still have me. We will get through this. I promise." But in that moment, none of her words could reach me. All I saw was the wreckage of my life spread across a highway in the rain. All I felt was emptiness, swallowing everything good that ever mattered. The next morning came too quickly. The sun pushed through the blinds like it was mocking the darkness in my chest. Nurses brought breakfast. Doctors talked about therapy plans. The world continued as if nothing had happened. I lay there wondering how a man was supposed to rebuild anything when every part of him had already been broken. And I did not know yet that the hardest choices were still ahead of me. I lay in that hospital bed long after the sun had started warming the walls, trying to understand how a person was supposed to start again with nothing left. A nurse wheeled in to check the monitors and asked if I wanted help sitting up. I told her I was fine, even though I was not. Every breath felt like dragging a weight tied to my ribs. By late morning, Julia came in carrying a small bag of clothes and a look that told me she had barely slept. She set the bag down and said softly that the doctor had cleared me for discharge if I had somewhere to go. The words hit harder than I expected. Discharge meant the world expected me to function again, walk again, live again. I could not do any of those things. I asked Julia if she thought her parents would let me stay for a while. She hesitated, then nodded carefully as if walking across thin ice. She said they might not show it, but they still cared about Lauren and Emma. Maybe they just needed time. I held on to that thread because it was the only thing that felt remotely like hope. After the paperwork and the instructions from Dr. Briggs about therapy schedules, Julia helped me get dressed. My hands shook every time I tried to pull fabric over my legs that I could no longer feel. A nurse transferred me into a wheelchair and wished me luck in a tone that felt too final. Julia pushed me through the exit. The sunlight was too bright. The air was warm, but it did not touch me. She lifted me into her car with the patience of someone far older than 29. When I thanked her, she only said we would take one step at a time. The drive to her parents' place in West Dallas felt longer than it was. The closer we got, the tighter my chest became. I remembered past dinners where Robert had questioned every career move I made and hinted that a real man would have joined his business instead of working with software. Sandra rarely missed a chance to remind me that Lauren could have done better, but I was sure that this was different. Death changed people. At least that's what I told myself. Julia parked in front of their house. It was a one-story place with a wide porch and a garage full of tools from Robert's auto shop. She opened my door and asked if I was ready. I told her I was, even though my hands were sweating. She wheeled me up this path and knocked. Footsteps approached. The door opened only halfway, as if they were expecting a salesman. Robert stood there, still in his work shirt, arms crossed. His eyes traveled from my face to the wheelchair, then back again with no sign of surprise or sympathy. I said hello and told him I was being discharged and needed a place to stay while I began therapy. He did not move aside to let us in. He said that this was not a good time and that nothing could change what had happened. I told him I knew that. I only needed a roof and some support while I figured out my next steps. He let out a breath that sounded like annoyance. He said that ever since I married Lauren, he had warned her that my job in tech was unstable, and that now everything he predicted had come true. Before I could respond, Sandra appeared behind him. She was holding a mug of coffee and looked at me like I was something the rain had dragged in. She asked why I was there and why Julia had brought me. I tried to stay calm. I told them the truth. I had lost my family. I had lost my job. I could not walk. I did not know what else to do. Sandra shook her head slowly. She said they had their own problems. The garage was struggling. Bills were piling up. Taking care of someone in my condition was impossible. She added that they were still grieving Lauren and that seeing me would make it harder. The words stung like a slap, but what hurt most was that she said them with no hesitation or guilt. I felt heat rising in my neck. I reminded them that I had loved Lauren as much as they did, that Emma was my daughter, that we should stand together. Robert stepped forward and said grief did not erase responsibility. He told me I needed to learn how to manage on my own because life does not pause for anyone. I could feel Julia tense behind me. She asked her parents how they could speak like that when I had just lost everything. Sandra looked at her and said she needed to stop letting emotions cloud her judgment. She said that maybe if I had taken the job at their garage years ago, things would have been different. That maybe the accident would not have happened. The air left my lungs. Blame was something I expected from strangers, but hearing it from the people who raised my wife felt unbearable. I told them I just needed a little time. They said no. Then Sandra pointed at the old leather wallet tucked beside me in the wheelchair. She smirked and said that if I was counting on whatever was in there to save me, I would be disappointed. She always believed I held on to it because it was the only thing I was proud of. That was the moment something inside me collapsed. Not anger, not even shock, just emptiness. Robert placed his hand on the door and said, "They were sorry for what happened, but they could not take me in. He told Julia to drive me back to wherever I came from. Then he closed the door. Just like that. No hug, no condolences, no humanity. Julia whispered an apology that she did not owe me and wheeled me back to her car. Rain started to fall again, soft but steady. By the time she folded the wheelchair into the trunk, I could not look at the house anymore. I felt like a ghost haunting a place that never wanted me there. During the drive, she kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other near me as if ready to catch anything I might drop, even my sanity. She told me I could stay with her until I figured things out. I tried to refuse, but my voice cracked. She told me to stop pretending I could manage this alone. When we reached her apartment in Plano, she helped me inside. It was small but warm, a place with character and color. Nothing like the cold house we had just left. She set up a space for me near the window and made sure I had everything I needed. She asked if I wanted something to eat. I shook my head. I sat there staring at the dark sky. I had no home, no family, no job, no future I could see. I thought that was as low as life could push a man. I did not know yet that the thing that would change everything was already in that old wallet Sandra mocked, waiting for the moment I finally had nothing left. I spent most of that first night in Julia's apartment, staring at the dim streetlights outside her window, listening to the hum of traffic below. The room was quiet, but my mind was loud. Every few minutes, the crash replayed in my head. The sound of metal and Lauren's voice and Emma's small cry, looping until my chest tightened. I barely slept. When the morning light finally came through the blinds, it felt like an unwelcome reminder that I still had to keep breathing. Julia knocked on the door frame and asked if I wanted coffee. I told her no, though the truth was, I did not taste anything anymore. She set a cup beside me anyway. She had that calm persistence that made it easier to accept help even when my pride protested. She reminded me I had a physical therapy appointment in an hour, and that she would drive me. The clinic sat behind a strip mall in Plano, tucked between a dental office and a dry cleaner. Inside, it smelled like disinfectant and rubber mats. The therapist, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis, greeted us with a handshake and a sympathetic look. He had clearly seen enough spinal patients to understand the mix of fear and numbness in my eyes. He helped lift me onto a padded table and explained the plan. We would start with simple transfers and upper body work, then assess what muscle response remained in my legs. I nodded, though the words felt far away. When he pressed along my spine, a dull electric ache spread across my lower back. When he tried to move my legs, I felt nothing, not even a flicker. Curtis kept his tone steady. He said recovery would be slow and uncertain, but not impossible. Progress came in inches, not miles. I listened and wanted to believe him, but the weight of reality just sat in my chest like a stone. After an hour, I was drenched in sweat and trembling. Curtis said that was normal. I did not feel normal. I felt broken. Julia helped me back into the wheelchair and guided me outside. The Texas heat hit me in a wave. She asked if I wanted to grab lunch. I said maybe later. My voice was barely more than a breath. Back at the apartment, she helped me settle into the recliner near the window. She moved quietly around the kitchen, chopping vegetables, boiling water, doing all the small things people do when they are trying to hold someone else together. At one point, she peeked into the living room to check on me. "You doing okay?" I told her I was fine. It was an obvious lie. In the following days, a routine formed. Julia left for her graphic design jobs in the mornings and came back mid-afternoon. I spent hours in therapy, pushing through exercises that made me feel as if my body belonged to someone else. At night, I lay awake replaying everything I had lost. Sometimes I would see Lauren smiling as she brushed hair from her eyes. Sometimes I heard Emma laughing the way she used to when I lifted her into the air. Grief came in waves that knocked me out without warning. One afternoon, Julia came home with groceries and placed a bag on the counter. She looked tired, but still tried to smile. She told me her parents had called again. They wanted her to stop helping me and focus on her own life. The words hit me harder than I expected. I told her she did not have to sacrifice her time for me. She snapped back with an unusual sharpness. I am not doing this because I have to. I am doing it because you are family. Then her voice softened. And because Lauren would want someone to stand with you. I did not know what to say. Gratitude and shame twisted together until I could not separate them. I nodded and looked away. Later that week, she decided to tidy the living room since my things were scattered across the floor. She opened a box of personal items the hospital had sent with me, old notebooks, a cracked charger, keys to a house that no longer felt like mine. In the bottom corner, she found my grandfather's worn leather wallet, the same one Sandra mocked outside her door. She held it up. This yours? Looks like it has been through a lot. I reached for it, feeling a strange heaviness in my chest. My grandfather Harold had given it to me the summer I turned 18. He used to sit with me on his porch in Fort Worth and tell me stories about growing up in the Depression, about how you could lose everything and still start over. He was the only person who ever believed I was capable of more than what people expected. Julia opened the wallet carefully, checking if anything inside needed organizing. A faded family picture, an old membership card to a fishing lodge he used to take me to, and then a small metal card slipped out and clinked onto the table. It had a clean silver finish and a bank logo engraved on the corner. First Federal Trust. Julia picked it up. What is this? Some kind of access card? I stared at it, remembering something my grandfather once told me. If life ever puts you somewhere you cannot climb out of, use what I left you. He said it with a serious look, but at the time I assumed he meant a small emergency fund or some sentimental keepsake. I never asked again. I took the metal card from her and turned it over. There was no name, no number, no expiration date. Just a raised emblem and a strip of metallic coating along the back. I had never used it. I had forgotten it was even there. Julia watched me closely. Should we call the bank and ask? Maybe it is something important. For the first time in weeks, a different feeling stirred under the grief. Not hope, just curiosity. A thin spark in a dark room. I told her maybe we should. She nodded and pulled out her phone. When she connected with the bank's automated system, the menu options sounded vague and unhelpful. Eventually, she reached a live person. She explained we had an old access card belonging to the Callahan family and asked what it might be linked to. There was a long pause on the line, followed by the representative asking if we could come in with identification for verification. The tone had shifted from polite to formal. It was enough to make both of us exchange a glance. After the call ended, Julia raised her eyebrows. That sounded serious. You think your grandfather hid some offshore money? She smiled a little, trying to lighten the mood. I shook my head. Harold lived modestly. He fixed tractors. He grew tomatoes. He wore the same boots for 20 years. The idea of him having anything significant felt impossible. Still, the metal card weighed heavier in my hand than it should have. As the afternoon faded into a soft orange glow through the blinds, I sat there rolling the card between my fingers. Grief was still there, but now it shared space with something I had not felt since the crash. A question without an answer. Julia walked past me and paused. You want to go tomorrow morning? She asked it gently, without pressure. I looked at the card one more time and nodded. Yeah, maybe it is time to find out what he meant. She smiled, tired but warm, and said she would drive. After she went to her room, I remained by the window, letting the faint reflections stretch across the darkening glass. I did not believe in fate, and I did not believe in miracles. But that card had stayed with me through years of moves and pockets and forgotten drawers. It had survived the crash. It had survived being thrown in the corner of a hospital box. It had survived everything. It survived. Now it was sitting in my hand as the only object in my life that felt like it might still hold a purpose. I closed my eyes and held it tighter, wondering what my grandfather had known that I did not. By the time I fell asleep, the card was still beside me, resting on the arm of the chair, waiting for whatever tomorrow would bring. Julia drove us to the First Federal Trust branch in downtown Dallas the next morning. The sky was overcast, but bright enough to make me squint as she helped me out of the car and into the wheelchair. I held the metal card in my hand, the entire ride, tracing its smooth edges, trying to make sense of why my grandfather had guarded it so carefully. A part of me still believed it would amount to nothing more than an old safe deposit box with a few letters or keepsakes. But the tone of the bank representative from the day before kept echoing in my mind. Inside, the lobby was quiet and cool. Polished floors, tall ceilings, soft lighting, all of it too clean compared to the mess my life had become. A young woman at the reception desk greeted us with a rehearsed smile. But the moment she saw the card in my hand, her expression changed. Her eyes widened slightly before she stood straighter and spoke with a more formal tone. "Sir, if you will allow me, I need to notify a senior manager." She asked for my ID, typed something quickly into her computer, then excused herself. Julia glanced at me with a raised eyebrow. I shrugged, though a knot was tightening in my stomach. After a moment, an older man in a tailored navy suit approached us. He looked like someone who had been running banks longer than I had been alive. He extended a hand. "Mr. Callahan, my name is Andrew Aldridge, branch manager. Please come with me." Julia pushed my wheelchair behind him down a quiet hallway. He opened a door to a private office and motioned for us to enter. The blinds were half closed, the room dim except for the desk lamp. It felt too serious for something simple. He sat behind the desk while we settled in front. He took both of his hands and set them neatly on the surface before speaking. "Before I can give you any information, I need to complete identity verification and authenticate your access level regarding this card." Access level. The phrase alone made my pulse spike. He asked for my driver's license, scanned it, then had me sign a digital pad. Next came biometric verification, a fingerprint scan, a short audio recording repeating a specific phrase. Finally, he placed the metal card into a reader built into his desk. The screen beside him flickered with lines of encrypted data. Aldridge nodded slowly, as if something he had expected was being confirmed. He turned the monitor away, then cleared his throat. "Mr. Callahan, this card is a legacy access ledger key tied to a private family trust. It was established by your grandfather, Harold Callahan, on a sealed registry. You are listed as the sole beneficiary." I stared at him, not fully understanding. My grandfather had lived simply. He bought the same brand of jeans for 30 years. He clipped coupons. He gave me $5 whenever I cut his lawn. He was not a man who kept secrets worth a banking manager. I asked quietly how large the trust was. Aldridge hesitated for the briefest moment, then answered in a controlled tone. "The total valuation is approximately $1.5 billion. The room went silent. Then everything inside me tilted. Billion. With a B. Julia covered her mouth with her hand and looked at me with wide eyes. My pulse hammered. My brain rejected the number as if it belonged to someone else. I had to swallow twice before my voice worked. I think you must have the wrong person. My grandfather was not a billionaire. Aldridge folded his hands again and spoke gently. Your grandfather invested in commercial real estate beginning in the late 70s and made several unusually successful acquisitions. He also held early stock positions in multiple companies that grew significantly over the last 3 decades. All of it was kept in a private trust structure for reasons he documented in a video message for you. He slid a small USB drive across the desk. This contains his recorded instructions. I stared at the drive like it was radioactive. My mind could not reconcile the Harold I knew with the Harold Aldridge was describing. Aldridge continued. The trust includes cash reserves, a diversified equity portfolio, municipal bonds, REIT holdings, and partial ownership of 2 commercial developments. All of it is now under your control pending your signature to activate beneficiary management. Julia whispered my name, but it sounded distant. I pressed my hands against my knees just to feel something real. Nothing in my life made sense. 48 hours ago, I had no family, no job, no place to live, and no future. Now a stranger in a suit was telling me I could change my entire life with a signature. I managed to ask why my grandfather never said anything. Aldridge replied that Harold designed the trust to remain hidden until a specific set of criteria in his instructions was met. Something about personal crisis and need. Though he said the details were in the video. When he left the room briefly to print additional documents, Julia leaned in. Mark, this is incredible. He must have done all of this for you. I shook my head, still stunned. I do not understand why. He lived so simply. Julia touched my arm. Maybe he knew you would need it someday. Aldridge returned and handed me a packet of forms to review. My hands trembled slightly as I held them. Billionaires had estate planners, security teams, private jets. They did not sit in wheelchairs in borrowed apartments wondering how to pay for therapy. He assured me there was no rush to sign anything. He encouraged me to watch the video first and said the trust team would be available when I was ready. Before we left, he stood, shook my hand again, and looked me directly in the eyes. Your grandfather spoke very highly of you in his files. He wanted you to have a life free of the burdens he carried. I did not know what that meant, but the sincerity in his voice tightened my throat. Julia wheeled me back out into the lobby. The world looked the same, but nothing felt the same. The sun outside was brighter, the sounds of passing cars sharper. I felt weightless and heavy at the same time. She drove us back to her apartment in silence, giving me space to process what had just happened. When she parked, she turned to me. We should watch the video. I nodded because there was nothing else I could do. Inside, she set my laptop on the table and plugged in the USB. My hands shook as I pressed play. The screen flickered. There he was, my grandfather, sitting in his old wooden chair, wearing the same denim shirt he always wore on weekends. His voice was warm and steady. If you are watching this, Mark, then life has knocked you down, hard, but you cannot stay there. I felt my chest tighten as I leaned closer. Julia rested a hand on my shoulder, but I barely noticed. Harold spoke about choices he made, fortunes he built quietly, and mistakes he never wanted me to repeat. He said he kept the trust hidden because wealth can distort a man's path. He said he believed in my character more than anything he ever owned. Then he said something that made the back of my eyes burn. The world will not always be kind to you. Some people you trust will fail you. When that day comes, you must stand again. And when you do, this will help you rise. The video ended with him smiling faintly, as if he could see me through the screen. I sat there frozen while the laptop fan hummed. For the first time since the crash, something inside me shifted. Not fully healed, not even close, but something small and steady. a sense that maybe the story of my life was not over. Maybe it was changing shape. Julia knelt beside me, her voice soft. What now? Mark. I looked at the empty screen, still seeing my grandfather's face. I did not know the answer yet. But for the first time since the night of the accident, I wanted to find out. I sat there for a long time after the video ended, staring at the blank laptop screen while the weight of everything pressed down on me. My grandfather was gone. But somehow it felt like he had just walked into the room and put a hand on my shoulder. I had not felt anchored like that since before the accident. Julia waited quietly beside me, giving me space but not leaving. It took several minutes before I could speak. I think he knew. I finally whispered, maybe not the details, but he knew someday I would need something like this. Julia nodded slowly. He trusted you. That matters more than the money. I let the words sit. Trusted. I had not heard anyone say that in what felt like a lifetime. By the next morning, she convinced me that the first step was stabilizing my life, not making big decisions out of shock. She drove me to sign the initial activation documents at the bank with Aldridge. He explained that a financial advisory team would be assigned and a security consultation scheduled. It felt surreal hearing those phrases applied to me. A man who had been sleeping in a borrowed recliner 48 hours ago. Afterward, Julia and I discussed the next move. Staying in her small apartment was not sustainable. She had her own life, a career, clients to meet, projects to finish. She would never admit it, but taking care of me around the clock was exhausting. I told her I needed a place designed for someone with my condition. Something accessible, something safe. She agreed and offered to help look. Within a week, the trust team had arranged viewings for homes in Fort Worth and North Dallas. Most were polished properties meant for well-off retirees or executives. None of them felt right. Too large, too impersonal, too far from therapy centers. Finally, we found a single-story house in a quiet part of Fort Worth. Wide hallways, open layout, a large room that could fit medical equipment, and a peaceful backyard shaded by oak trees. It did not scream luxury. It felt calm. That was enough. I moved in 3 days later with Julia's help. She brought boxes of basic supplies, groceries, and everything I needed for the first month. She kept saying she would only stay long enough to help me get settled. But I could tell she did not want me in that house alone. The first night she slept in the guest room. The door cracked open in case I needed anything. That week became a blur of doctor appointments, evaluations, and therapy. The trust funded a home treatment team led by a specialist named Dr. Wilson. He was focused, direct, and did not sugarcoat anything. He said the nervous system could surprise us, but would only reward hard, painful work. I appreciated his honesty. Therapy sessions were brutal. Some mornings I woke drenched in sweat before the exercises even began. My arms shook from supporting my body. My lower back burned every time we tried to weight shift. One afternoon, I slid off the transfer board and hit the floor hard enough to knock the breath out of me. Julia rushed in from the kitchen and knelt beside me, panic in her eyes. I told her I was fine, even though my ribs pulsed with pain. She insisted on staying for every session after that. She took notes, asked Dr. Wilson questions, learned how to help with stretches and adjustments. Watching her fight for my recovery made me feel something heavy and unfamiliar. Gratitude mixed with guilt, mixed with a warmth I did not want to name yet. During this time, I received a text from Evan, the coworker who had warned me about Jeff. He asked if he could visit. I agreed. When he arrived, he looked stunned at the house. I told him it was a long story. We sat in the living room, Julia in the kitchen pretending not to listen. Evan let out a slow breath. I figured you should know. Jeff was pushing to replace you even before the accident. He wanted the credit for the SAS overhaul contract. The accident just made it easier for him to force you out. I felt anger rising, but it burned differently now, sharper and cleaner. Evan apologized again, saying he wished he had spoken up sooner. I told him none of it was his fault. People show who they are when there is something to gain. Jeff had shown himself. 2 days later, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would not spend my life crawling back to a company that tossed me aside. I would build something of my own, something that mattered, something that used the skills I had spent a decade refining. Red Hawk Dynamics. The name came to me while watching a hawk fly over the backyard. Wings spread wide, scanning the ground below. A survivor. A hunter. A creature built to rise. I contacted a legal team to set up the company. Within a week, I had an EIN, a business structure, an office lease in a modest but modern building, and 3 engineers hired through referrals. Julia shook her head when she saw the paperwork. You do not slow down, do you? I shrugged. If I stop, I fall apart. She smiled gently. Just do not forget you are still healing. I did not forget. Every night my legs reminded me. Every morning, too. But now there was forward motion, something beyond grief. Around the same time, my phone buzzed with a call from an unrecognized number. I let it ring. But Julia insisted I should answer unknown calls now that I was running a business and handling complex finances. I gave in. It was Sandra. Her voice was too sweet, too forced. She said she heard I had found a place in Fort Worth and hoped I was settling in. She hinted she wanted to visit. Then she mentioned that the garage was struggling and they were looking for investors. That word, investors, landed exactly where she wanted it to. I felt my jaw tighten. I told her I was focusing on recovery and building my company, and I ended the call quickly. Julia stood in the doorway watching me, reading my expression. They want something, she said quietly. I nodded. It is the only time they ever call. She sat beside me on the couch and looked down at her hands. I need to tell you something. My parents told me to pressure you, to find out what you had left. They think you are hiding money. I stared at her, not angry, only tired. Did you tell them anything? No, and I never will. The sincerity in her voice eased something inside me. I realized then how hard it must have been for her to stand between her parents and me. She had lost her sister too. She did not owe me anything. Yet she was here. The days that followed were filled with small victories. I managed to lift myself from the wheelchair to the bed without assistance. I could maintain a seated balance for almost a full minute. My therapists cheered. Julia clapped. I felt the faintest spark of pride. But one moment stood out more than any of those. One morning, while reaching across the armrest, I felt a flicker in my right leg. A tiny spark. Barely anything. But it was there. I froze, afraid I imagined it. Then it twitched again. Julia saw my expression and rushed over. What happened? I swallowed hard. My leg. I think it moved. She crouched beside me, her eyes bright. Try again. I focused. Nothing happened at first. Then another flicker, a soft jolt, almost like a reminder that my body had not fully given up on me. She covered her mouth with one hand and let out a shaky breath. Mark, that is huge. You are coming back. I stared down at my leg, overwhelmed. My throat tightened. For the first time since the crash, I felt the shape of hope. Later that afternoon, Julia brought dinner into the living room. She paused and looked at me thoughtfully. You know, your grandfather kept that card for a reason. Maybe he knew you would fight your way back. I sat quietly, thinking about the old man on the porch in his faded denim shirt. He had always told me a man's worth was not measured in what he had, but in what he could stand back up from. As the evening settled and the house grew quiet, I realized something else. My life was no longer defined by what I lost. It was being rebuilt, piece by piece, by the people who stayed when everyone else walked away. I did not know yet how far that rebuild would go, or how much more was waiting in the shadows. But for the first time in a long time, I welcomed the uncertainty. I woke up the next morning with a strange calm in my chest, the kind that comes after weeks of storming inside. My leg had twitched the day before, maybe only a fraction of an inch, maybe just a spark from damaged nerves. But it was real. I held on to that feeling while the early light slid across the bedroom wall. Julia was already in the kitchen making coffee. I could hear the soft clatter of mugs when she peeked her head in to check on me. She smiled in that quiet way she did when she did not want to overwhelm me with excitement. "Morning? Therapy in an hour. Think you can handle it?" I told her I could. The truth was, I would have crawled there if I had to. The session was harder than usual. Dr. Wilson pushed me, checking for any new response in my quadriceps. Every time I strained, I felt a faint pressure, like the ghost of movement. He nodded with approval. "This is promising. Not definitive, but promising. Keep doing what you are doing." Promising was a small word, but it felt like a ladder rung to grab onto. That afternoon, I had a meeting at the new office. Red Hawk Dynamics was barely a month old, but the space already hummed with energy. 4 developers sat at mismatched desks, their screens filled with code. I rolled in through the wide automatic doors, still in my wheelchair even though I was starting to experiment with brief standing practice. One of our first potential clients, a mid-sized logistics company in Fort Worth, wanted a system overhaul. I led the presentation from my chair, going through diagrams and projections, outlining how we could cut their processing time by nearly 40%. When the meeting ended, the CEO shook my hand and said he admired how direct and clear I was. "We will be in touch." He smiled like he already made the decision. Julia drove us back to the house. On the way, she mentioned she needed to stop at her parents' garage to pick up a few old documents she left there years ago. She asked if I wanted to come in or wait in the car. I said I would stay outside. Robert walked past the window when she entered. He glanced at me briefly, then at the wheelchair, then looked away, as if he did not recognize me. Or maybe he did, and wished he did not. I was used to that by now. When Julia came back out, she carried 2 folders and looked tense. She slid into the passenger seat and closed the door. "I think my dad is in trouble." I asked what she meant. She flipped open one of the folders and showed me copies of tax filings and financial summaries from the garage. "Look at this. Numbers that do not line up. Expenses claimed twice. Missing invoices. Everything feels off." I read through them, even without my tech background. The inconsistencies were obvious. If these were ever audited, the penalties could bury the garage. Julia ran a hand through her hair. "He is going to get himself into real trouble if he keeps doing whatever this is." I offered to look deeper when we got home. She nodded with a worried expression that said she already feared the answer. That evening, after dinner, we spread the papers across the dining table. I pulled out my laptop and created a spreadsheet to track the discrepancies. The more I typed, the clearer it became. This was not sloppy accounting. It was deliberate. Someone was inflating losses to reduce taxable income. That kind of fraud did not slip through unnoticed forever. At some point, Julia whispered that she did not want to believe her father would do something like this. I did not want to either, but the math did not care about feelings. I called Troy Benson, the attorney who helped me navigate the insurance issues weeks earlier. I explained what I found, and asked what someone was legally obligated to do if they discovered signs of tax fraud. He sighed when he heard the situation. If the documents are legitimate, you cannot ignore it. You can give them to me privately, and I will review them. But if there is fraud, it has to be reported. That is the law. After I hung up, Julia sat across from me looking drained. "Give them to Troy," she said quietly. "If my dad did this, he needs to face it." We drove the documents to Troy's office the next morning. He told us he would contact us once he verified everything. 2 days later, he called while I was practicing weight shifts with Dr. Wilson. His tone was firm. "The filings are fraudulent. I am required to forward this to the proper agency." You did the right thing. The proper agency was the IRS. The investigation hit fast. Within a week, agents froze the garage's active accounts for review. Local news picked up the story. A small shop in West Dallas under federal audit. It spread quickly, fueled by comments about how Robert had treated me after the accident. People online called it karma. I did not respond. I did not feel vindicated, only tired. Then Robert showed up at my house. Julia answered the door while I waited in the living room. I heard raised voices. She tried to stop him, but he pushed past her. He walked into the room, looking thinner, older, desperate. His eyes darted everywhere until they landed on me in the wheelchair. "You did this." His voice cracked like a frayed rope. I told him calmly that I had not done anything. He said the IRS froze everything, that his business was dying, that he needed help, money, a loan, anything. Julia stepped between us and told him loudly that he had no right to ask me for anything. He shouted at her for betraying him. She shouted back that he betrayed himself. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "My daughter is dead. My granddaughter is dead. You owe us." Something inside me went very still. "I owe you nothing." The room went quiet, except for Julia's unsteady breathing. I told him he lied on tax forms, that he blamed me for things he never took responsibility for, that he turned me away when I had nowhere else to go. I told him I was sorry he was hurting, but I would not carry his choices on my back. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small, not angry, not cruel, just collapsed. He whispered please, but the word held no weight anymore. I asked Julia to walk him to the door. She did. He left without looking back. When she returned, she leaned against the wall and covered her face with both hands. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She said she knew, but it still hurt. That night I sat alone in the living room while the house grew quiet and still. The weight of everything pressed into the silence. Loss, pain, the slow climb back, the people who stayed, the people who walked away, the people who tried to drag me back down with them. I thought about my grandfather's video, about standing again. I looked down at my right leg resting under the blanket. I focused. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a faint movement, a small twitch. It was not much, but it was enough to keep me fighting. And I had no idea that the next chapter of my life was already waiting just past the horizon. I leaned back in my chair and watched the faint twitch in my leg fade into stillness. It was small, barely noticeable unless you were staring straight at it. But it carried more weight than anything I had felt in a long time. It felt like the universe whispering that I was not done yet. A week later, the physical therapy team increased the intensity of my sessions. I pushed myself through every drill, every burn in my muscles, every moment where I felt my body tremble under the effort. I reminded myself that I had stood at the edge of the darkest place a man could stand. And somehow, I was still here. During one long afternoon session, I gripped the parallel bars, focused on my breathing, and shifted my weight forward. My legs shook. My arms trembled from holding myself up. Sweat rolled down my back. Dr. Wilson watched closely and said to try for one clean step. I closed my eyes and pictured my grandfather's face the way he looked in that old video. Calm, steady, patient. I felt something tighten inside me, something that refused to quit. My right foot moved. It was shaky and slow, but it moved. Then the left. I opened my eyes and realized I had taken 2 steps without collapsing. The room felt like it expanded around me. Julia covered her mouth and tears spilled down her face. I felt something warm break open inside my chest, and the weight of everything I had been carrying slipped off my shoulders for a moment. By the end of that month, I was using the walker around the house. The first time I made it from the bedroom to the kitchen without stopping, Julia clapped like I had just run a marathon. I laughed because for me it felt exactly like that. Red Hawk Dynamics kept growing. We secured the contract with a logistics company and then another with a regional medical distributor. Word spread fast that the company was run by a man who refused to back down from anything. The story of my recovery leaked into a few local articles again, and people kept sending messages, thanking me for being open about the hard parts. But life was not done testing me. One evening, while Julia was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed with a message from Troy. He said the IRS had completed their investigation and that Robert might be facing charges. I stared at the message for a long time, without responding. There was no satisfaction in it, no feeling of revenge fulfilled, only a quiet acceptance that this was the road he had chosen, not me. A few days later, Julia told me she needed to talk. She said her family was falling apart. Her mother barely left the house, and her father was drowning in legal trouble. She said she felt guilty for not stepping in more, even though she knew she had done the right thing. She asked me if she should go see them. I told her she should do whatever would help her sleep at night. She nodded and left that afternoon. When she came back, her eyes were swollen, but her voice was steady. She told me her father had apologized. Not for everything, but for enough. She said it still hurt, but at least there was something real behind his words this time. Winter came early that year. Frost covered the windows in the mornings, and the air smelled like pine and cold metal. My progress kept building, and those tiny twitches in my legs turned into something stronger. On a quiet Sunday morning, I stood in the living room, hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. I shifted my weight forward, took a breath, and stepped away from the support. One step, then another, then another. When I reached the other side of the room, I stopped and turned around. Julia was standing in the hallway, trembling like she was afraid if she blinked I would fall. I told her I was fine. She walked toward me and rested her forehead against my shoulder. I felt her relief in every breath she took. 3 months later, I walked without the walker. 6 months later, I walked without a limp for the first time. My legs felt like my own again. My life felt like it belonged to me again. By the 1-year mark, the company had expanded to a full floor in a downtown Dallas building. I hired a dozen new engineers and a small operations team. The office buzzed with the kind of energy that made you forget how late it was. Every morning I walked through the doors on my own 2 feet. Every time it felt like a small miracle. That spring I visited the cemetery for the first time in over a year. I walked the whole distance alone. I carried 2 bouquets of white lilies. Standing between the 2 headstones, I felt the wind shift through the trees. I told them both I had not forgotten a single moment. I told them I hoped they would be proud. I told them I was learning how to live again. When I walked back to the car, Julia was waiting with the door open. She did not say anything. She did not have to. Life settled in a strange new balance. Not perfect, not painless, but solid, strong, honest. Then one night, as we sat on the back porch watching the sky fade from orange to blue, Julia touched my hand and said she had been wanting to ask me something but was afraid it might be too soon. I told her nothing about my life had been too soon or too late anymore. Everything came exactly when it was supposed to. She asked what I thought our future looked like. I looked at her for a long time. At the woman who held me up when I had nothing, who watched me fight for every inch of ground, who stayed when everyone else pulled away. I told her I did not know exactly what our future looked like, but I knew I wanted to walk toward it with her. She leaned against me and we stayed there until the air grew cold and the stars came out. If you have ever been pushed to the bottom, if life ever took everything from you, I hope my story shows you that the climb back up is still possible. It does not happen fast. It does not happen clean. But it does happen. And if this story meant something to you, if you felt even one moment that hit close to home, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share what part stayed with you. Drop a comment, or just stick around for more stories like this. Your voice keeps this place alive.